So, good evening, everyone. So, this is another lesson discussion in our subject assessment in Learning 2. So, this is supposed to be the lesson 5 in our midterm for our midterm coverage. So, if you are ready or whenever you are ready, so let us start. So, after learning that performance based or authentic assessment consists of product based and process based assessment, I am wishing that you still remember our previous lesson regarding this product and process based assessment. So, let us now learn how to score a product produced or process performed by the learners by means of scoring rubrics. So we will explore the definition of the scoring rubrics and the types of scoring rubrics and etc. So the alternate response, multiple choice, and completion types of traditional assessment do not require scoring rubric because they have definite correct answers, and all you do is check if the given answer is correct and mark wrong if the answer is wrong. So the essay type of test naman is a form of a product-based assessment. So calls for a scoring rubric and also with other product-based assessment and product process-based authentic performance or the base assessment because that the answers are far beyond yes or no or true or false or they have no single correct answers. So just like the multiple choice or the objective assessment. So let us now define the definition or let us now define the scoring rubric. So a scoring rubric is a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance quality on the criteria. So, according to Macmillan, he defines scoring rubrics as a scoring guide that uses criteria to differentiate between levels of a student proficiency. According to Popham, describes scoring rubrics as the scoring procedures for judging the students' responses to performance tests. So, in short, a scoring rubric is a scoring guide used to assess performance or what we call the process or the product against a set of criteria. So, for example, uh, um, processes and products that are assessed by a rubric. So, the scoring rubrics are typically employed when a judgment of quality is required and may be used to evaluate a broad range of subjects and activities. So, for example, scoring rubrics can be most useful in grading essays or in evaluating projects such as scrapbooks. So, the judgments concerning the quality of a given writing sample may vary depending upon the criteria established by the individual evaluator. So, one evaluator may heavily weigh the evaluation process upon the linguistic structure, while another evaluator may be more interested in the persuasiveness of the argument. So, a high quality essay is likely to have a combination of this and other factors. So, by developing a predefined scheme for the evaluation process, the subjectivity involved in evaluating an essay becomes more objective. So, we are done defining the scoring rubric. So, let us now proceed to the parts of the scoring rubric. So, what are the parts of the scoring rubric? So, a scoring rubrics has two major parts. So this is the coherent sets of criteria and descriptions of levels of performance for these criteria. So, we have here the example table that shows the what we call the recitation rubric. So, the recitation rubric given here is a number of appropriate hand gestures, the appropriate facial expression, the voice inflection, and the incorporate proper ambience through feelings in the voice. So it has three levels of performance. the 1, 2, and 3. So this describe the specifically for every criterion of performance. So the second column is the weight per criterion. So for criteria. So this incorporates the proper ambience, true feelings in the voice has the greatest weight. So as you can see here, we have the level 3. So the students can receive 3, 6, or 9 points. So for example, 1, 2, or 3 times. So 3 times 3 is equal to 9 points. So whichever is most appropriate for the students in this criterion. So as you can see here, now 1, 2, and 3. So the recitation rubric also contains what we call the descriptors. So this is also commonly known as the component of the rubrics. So the descriptors spell out what is expected at each level of performance for each criterion. So in the recitation rubric, lots of the inappropriate facial expression. So excuse me for this. This is lots of inappropriate facial expression. So monotone voice use, and the recitation contains very little things. So these are the examples of what we call the descriptors. So the question here is, why are descriptors important? So why do we need to include the descriptors? Because the descriptors tell students more precisely what performance look like at each level and how their work may be distinguished from the work of others per criterion. So similarly, the descriptors help the teacher more precisely and consistently distinguish between the student work. So why do we have to include levels of performance? So number one reason is that clear expectation. So it is very useful for the students and the teacher if the criteria are identified and communicated prior to completion of the task. So students know what is expected of them and teachers know what to look for a student performance. So similarly, student better understand what good or bad performance is on a task looks like if levels of the performance are identified, particularly if the descriptors for each level are included. So number two is we have the more consistent and objective assessment. So in addition to better communicating teacher expectations, levels of performance permit the teacher to more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance, or between superior, mediocre, or the poor performance when evaluating the student work. So the third reason why is better feedback, of course. So furthermore, identifying specific levels of student performance allows the teacher to provide more detailed feedback to the students. So the teachers and the students can more clearly recognize areas that need improvement. So these are the reasons why it is very important to include the levels of performance. Number one reason is it is contributes to clear expectations, it is more consistent and objective assessment, and better feedback. So in a scoring rubrics, we also considered the types of it. So these are the analytic and the holistic rubrics. So let us now differentiate these two. So for a particular task, you assign students. Do you want to be able to assess how well the students perform on each criterion, or do you want to get a more global picture of the students' performance on the entire task? So the answer to the question is likely to determine this type. So which do you prefer, the analytic or the holistic rubrics? In analytic rubric, This articulates levels of performance for each criterion so the teacher can access student performance on each criterion. So using the our example in our previous presentation, we have the recitation rubric. A teacher could assess whether a student has done a poor, good, or excellent job of creating the ambience and distinguish that from how well the student did on a voice infection. So, in contrast to analytic rubric, we have the holistic rubric. So this assigns a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole. So always remember in holistic rubric, it assigns level of performance, while as we go back here in analytic rubric, it is just articulates the level of performance for each criterion. So while in holistic rubric, it uses level of performance by using the multiple criteria. So in contrast to analytic, the holistic rubric does not list separate levels of performance for each criterion. So let us now answer the next question. So when to choose an analytic and holistic rubric? So let us first answer when to choose an analytic rubric. So we all know that the analytic rubrics are more common because teachers typically want to assess each criterion separately. So particularly for assignments that involve a larger number of criteria. So it becomes more and more difficult to assign a level of performance in a holistic rubric as the number of criteria increases. So as a student performance increasingly varies across criteria, it becomes more difficult to assign an appropriate holistic category to the performance. So additionally, an analytic rubric is better handled in weighting of criteria. So let us now answer when to choose the holistic rubric. So when may you use the holistic if it tends to be used when a quick or gross judgment needs to be made. So if the assessment is a minor one, such as brief homework assessment, or it may be sufficient to apply a holistic judgment. For example, check or no check or check plus, that is quickly to review by the or to review the work of the students. So always but I want you to understand also that the holistic rubric can also be employed for more substantial assignments. So on some tasks, it is not easy to evaluate performance on one criterion independently of the performance on a different criterion. So for example, many writing rubrics are holistic because it is not always easy to distangle the clarity from organization or content from presentation. So some educators believe a holistic or global assessment of a student performance better captures a student ability on a certain task. So this is when you choose the analytic and the holistic rubric. So how many levels of performance should I include in my rubric? So I want you to remember that there is no specific number of levels a rubric should or should not possess. So it will vary depending on the task and your needs. So a rubric can have as few as 2 levels of performance. For example, is a checklist, or as many as you decide as appropriate. So also, it is not true that there must be an even number or odd number of levels. So again, that will depend on the situation. So generally, it is better to start with a smaller number of levels of performance for a criterion and then expand if necessary. So, marking distinction in student performance across two or three broad categories is very difficult enough. So, as the number of levels increases and those judgments becomes finer and finer, the likelihood of error increases. So, thus, is it is better to start small. So, for example, in an oral presentation, rubric amount of eye contact with the audience might an important criterion. So the performance on that criterion could be judged along three levels, that is never, sometimes, and always. So although these three levels may not capture all the variation in the student performance on the criterion, it may be sufficient discrimination for your purposes, or at the least, it is place to start. So upon applying the three levels of performance, you might discover that you can effectively group your students' performance in these three categories. So furthermore, you might discover that the levels of never, sometimes, always sufficiently communicate to your students the degree to which they can improve on making eye contact. So on the other hand, after applying the rubric, you might discover that you cannot effectively discriminate among student performances with just three levels of performance. So in your view, many students fall in between the never and the sometimes, or between the sometimes or always. So, or neither label accurately captures their performance. So, at this point, you may decide to expand the number of levels of performance to include the never, rarely, sometimes, usually, and always. So, um, in here, you just include the three levels, but here you include the never and the usually. So, in here, there is no right answer as to how many levels of performance there should be for a criterion in an analytic rubric. So, that will depend on the nature of the task assigned. So, the criteria being evaluated, the students involved in your purposes and preferences. So, for example, another teacher might decide to leave off the always level in the above rubric because usually is as much as normally can be expected or even wanted in some instances. So, the makes eye contact portion of the rubric for the teacher might be the never, rarely, sometimes, and the usually. So, we recommend the fewer levels of performance be included initially because it is easier and quicker to administer. It is easier to explain to students, and it is easier to expand than larger rubrics to shrink. So now, how to decide on appropriate criteria. So in developing or in selecting a rubric, the first questions we ask is, what are the criteria for a good performance or product that the rubric ought to assess? So the criteria should be the most appropriate and most important aspects of a quality work. So whether it is a performance or product assessment. So as described in the learning outcome and not characteristics of the performance or product task itself. So for example, example of the aspects of the quality performance or the product which are evidence of learning and the attainment of the learning outcome that should be assessed by a rubric. So for example, selection of subject, analysis of a famous person's contribution to history, and such. So the examples naman of the characteristics of the student's work which would not be assessed by a rubric because they are not evidence of the learning. So, for example, is the cover of the report or the report on famous persons or the visual or the references. So, we have here the criteria for classroom rubrics that should guide you in developing a rubric. So we have here the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characteristics. So when we say appropriate, each criterion represents as aspects of the standard curricular goal or instructional goal or objective that the students are intended to learn. So it must be appropriate to your subject matter versus to your rubrics. So definable. So each criterion has a clear, agreed upon meaning that both students and teachers understand, of course. Next is observable. So each criterion describes quality in the performance that can be perceived by someone other than a person performing. So the performance or the rubrics must be visible and observable by the evaluator and at the same time by the audience and the person performed. Next is the distinct from one another. So each criterion identifies a separate aspect of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. Next is complete. All the criteria together describe the whole of the learning outcomes the performance is intended to assess. So it must be complete. It is not just describe one aspect of the assessment. Next is able to support descriptions. I am so sorry. This is descriptions along a continuum of quality. So each criterion can be described over a range of performance levels. So these are the characteristics of criteria for the classroom rubric. So we have the appropriate, definable, observable, distinct from one another, complete, and able to support a descriptions along a continuum of quality. So the development of the scoring rubrics goes through a process. So the first step, so these are the process of developing scoring rubrics. So number one, or the first step is identification of the qualities and attributes that the teacher wishes to observe in the students' outputs that would demonstrate their level of proficiency. So these qualities and attributes from the top level of the scoring criteria for the rubrics. So once done, a decision has to be made whether a holistic or analytical rubric would be more appropriate to use. And I want you to take note of this or to remember in an analytic scoring rubric, each criterion is considered one by one and the descriptions of the scoring levels are made separately. So here, each criterion is considered one by one and the descriptions of the scoring levels are made separately. So this will then result in a separate descriptive scoring scheme for each of the criterion or scoring factor. On the other hand, the holistic scoring rubrics, the collection of criteria is considered throughout the construction of each level of the scoring rubric. So the result is a single descriptive scoring scheme. So in analytic, the result is in a separate descriptive scoring scheme, while in the holistic, the result is a single descriptive scoring scheme. So the next step after the defining the criteria for the top level of performance is the identification and definition of the criteria for the lowest level of the performance. So in other words, the teacher is asked to determine the type of performance that would constitute the worst performance or a performance which would indicate lack of understanding of the concepts being measured. So the underlying reason for this step is for the teacher to capture the criteria that would suit a middle level performance for the concept being measured. So in particular, the approach suggested would result in at least 3 levels of performance. So it is of course possible to make greater and greater distinctions between performances. So for instance, we can compare the middle level performance expectations with the best performance criterion and come up with an average performance criterion. So between the middle level of performance expectations and the worst level of performance to come up with a slightly below average performance criteria and so on. So this comparison process can be used until the desired number of score levels is reached or until no further distinctions can be made. So if meaningful distinctions between the score categories cannot be made, then additional scores categories should not be created. So it is better to have a few meaningful score categories than to have many score categories that are difficult or impossible to distinguish. So I want you to take note of this. So it is suggested that each score category should be defined using the descriptors of the work rather than the value judgment about the work. So for example, students' sentences contain no errors in subject-verb agreements. The student sentences are good, so that is the phrase are good requires the evaluator to make a judgment, whereas the phrase no errors is quantifiable. So finally, we can test whether our scoring rubrics is reliable by asking 2 or more teachers to score the same set of projects or outputs and correlate their individual assessments. So high correlations between the raters imply high inter-rater in reliability. So if the scores assigned by teachers differ greatly, then it suggests a way to refine the scoring rubrics we have developed. So it may be necessary to clarify the scoring rubrics so that they would mean the same thing to different scorers. So to sum it up, we have the first step is to identify the appropriate criteria to assess and refer. We can refer to the recitation rubrics in our previous presentation. So there are 4 criteria there. And the step 2 is for each criterion formulate the description of the performance along a continuum of quality. So we have here another type of rubric. So we have the general and task-specific rubrics. So as the name implies, the general rubrics, these are the particularly useful for fundamental skills such as writing, mathematics, problem solving, and general traits like creativity. So they contain criteria that are general across tasks. That's why they can be reused. So these general rubrics can be adapted to different grade levels to make them task-specific rubric. So in a task-specific rubric, this is unique to a specific task. So you can use task-specific rubric if as a reliable assessment of performance on a specific task such as gives an answer or specify a conclusion. So however, a task-specific rubric is time-consuming and difficult to create for all the different tasks you'd like to assess. However, it makes scoring easier. So let us now talk the importance of the rubrics. So rubrics are very important. So they ensure the constructive alignment that we discussed in outcome-based education, if you remember. So with the scoring rubrics, students and teachers are clarified because they clarify for students the qualities their work should have. So this point is often expressed in terms of the students understanding the learning target and criteria for success. So for these reasons, rubrics help teachers teach, they help coordinate instruction and assessment, and they help the students learn. So according to Brookhart, he explains how rubrics can ensure learning. So number one is we have here the So number one is rubrics help teachers teach. So when teachers develop the rubrics, they get very much clarified with the criteria by which learning will be assessed, and so will become more focused on what to teach and against what criteria student success will be measured. Number two is rubrics help students learn. So the criteria and performance level descriptions in rubrics help students understand what performance and criterion of performance are expected of them. So number three is rubrics help coordinate instruction and assessment. So furthermore, rubrics enhance a student or learner agency. So agency is characterized by the student's ability to set and pursue his or her learning goals, an important ingredient for a student's success through college and careers, and most especially at the height of the pandemic when remote learning is the way to go. So, let us now discuss the checklist and the rating scales. So, in authentic assessment schemes, apart from scoring rubrics, these are the we have here the checklist and rating scales, which are often confused with rubrics. So checklists and rating scales differ from scoring rubrics in the sense that they lack descriptions of the performance quality, which is one of the two main characteristics of the scoring rubrics. So like rubrics, checklists, and rating scales, we have criteria. So the criteria for checklist and rating scales are the list of things that you check or rate. So if something has been done, so just check, or we can find it in the checklist, and or how often it has been done, or in a rating scales. So let's now first discuss the checklist. So a checklist is a list of the specific characteristics with a place for marking whether that characteristic is present or absent. So checklists are used when learning outcomes are defined by the existence of an attribute. So we have here a table or a figure. For example, here, this is a sentence skills checklist. So my sentence begins with a capital letter, ends with a period or a question mark. If your sentence begins with a capital, so you put check. If it ends with a period, you put check or a mark, or is a complete thought, put a mark, or has a naming part, and etc. So a checklist is also to make sure students have follow directions for an assignment, that they have all the required parts of some project, or that they have followed format requirements for a report. So take note that the checklist that does not evaluate the quality of the project. So it just makes sure that the directions have been followed and all required elements are present. So I want you to focus here in our figure. So this is the research report checklist. So for example, the research report has an introduction. If it has, you just put a mark here, or a check, or whatever. It has this sentence or a research question, and etc. So the checklist does not include an evaluation of the quality of the research report that may include criteria for the analysis of the topic subject of the research report. sound reasoning, and logical analysis of finding a coherence of thought or the etc. So let's now proceed to the rating scale. So a rating scale is a list of specific characteristics with a place for marking the degree to which each characteristic is displayed. So an example of the frequency rating scale that lists the frequency with which some characteristics are observed. So for example, in public speaking, the characteristics makes eye contact is done frequently, occasionally, seldom, or never. So we have here scale, and the corresponding scale that you may use is, for example, always, frequently, sometimes, never, and etc. And for the scale, it has also indicated here the descriptor on when or how to use the always, frequently. So for example, here in always, frequently, etc., it is used to rate how often students exhibit behaviors and etc. While on almost, some, none, you will just use this if you will rate how often problems or exercises exhibit and etc. This is the example of the frequency scales. So, in a frequency rating scale, for example, is a high school chemistry teacher used to help her students check their own work on volume and temperature problems. So the rating scale indicates how many problems. So you may use almost, some, or none because the skill was demonstrated. So now we have here the rating scale used for student self-assessment. So you have here the skill incorporated, and you have here another indicator, for example, all problems, most, some, and none of the problems. So that's all for today's discussion. So I hope you learned something. So same mechanics. I left you here an activity that is to be submitted on May 15, 2023. So I hope you learned something, and thank you very much, and God bless. So make sure to finish the video presentation for you to know the activity for lesson 5. So this is the performance activity for lesson 5. So answer the following questions. So this is consist of 50 points. So put your answer in the comment section below by following the formats. So don't forget to include your name, your block, or your cluster. So I don't want you to put whether you are in an online or in a face-to-face. I want you to put block and cluster where you belong. So for example, you belong to block A or block B. So you just put block A, and cluster for those outside the main. Next, and your answer. So these are the question. Number 1, distinguish between holistic and analytic rubrics, general and task-specific rubric. Number 2 is, when do you use a holistic rubric, analytic rubric, general rubric, and task-specific rubric? So again, the deadline of submission of the performance activity is on May 15, 2023, 8 o'clock p.m. only. So thank you very much. God bless.